Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another exciting round of Smack Talk. I'm your host, James Cervone.
I'm Jacob.
I'm Star.
I'm the funnier Jacob.
I'm pretty fitting to the name of the series. Today's episode is going to be on video game violence. So, what would we be talking about there? Kind of what violence shows up. Is it desensitizing people? Is it when is it too much? When is it time to stop?
Personally, I don't really think there's a necessary stopping point with video game violence. It is all virtual, and I feel like it really depends for each person. Some people can't take a certain amount of realism in their video game violence, and some people can take it and not be affected. It really is just it's a case-by-case basis. I don't necessarily think there should be an overall stopping point, as I believe art shouldn't be censored, and if we've seen by last episode, video games are art. And I wouldn't want to be the person to say, we should censor that, because I don't think we should.
Well, I do agree that art should be allowed to flourish, but I do think there should be limits on things because, especially depending on when you start with the video game violence and your exposure level, you can become desensitized to that kind of stuff, and that is generally not a good thing, to be desensitized to the suffering of others. And I think it really does. That depends on how well your parents have raised you and supervised your gameplay, because obviously you're more prone to being desensitized to something like that from an early age. But also, the amount of exposure you get now and just how long you expose yourself to it, you could still desensitize yourself to stuff if you don't understand, if you can't make the connection that there's a difference, or even if you just continue to do so for a long time without really any regard for the effects on yourself.
Yeah, I was gonna say, at what point, who's to blame here, though? When it ends up becoming a problem, is it the game company for making it? Is it the person for playing it? Or is it family for not monitoring it?
I don't think you should blame the artists for their own art,
I think it's the bad parents' fault for buying little 5-year-old Timmy the newest Call of Duty game, honestly.
It really is. If anyone's going to restrict it, it really should be the parents on the children. I was raised in a very strict household when it came to that, but then again, I had parents who knew all about the video game rating system, the ESRB, what's in video games. So I was restricted because they knew firsthand. I honestly think that was for the better, because I didn't get super. I didn't play Grand Theft Auto 5 until I was way older as a kid. I didn't get to buy any of the more violent games like the later Mortal Kombat's until
Mortal Kombat was always incredibly violent.
Well, yeah. There were just a couple things I was restricted on. Honestly, I think the best limit video games have and will have is probably just the rating system itself, as you can go to a certain level of violence and still be considered M, but there eventually comes a point where it gets to an A rating. Like Hatred, for example, I believe was an A rating purely on violence.
I don't think it was, because I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, there are around 17 to 18 games rated adults only.
I believe that was one of them.
Was it? It might have been the most recent edition list, but
I remember that
only,
was the controversy.
But over the vast majority of them aren't there for violent content. They're there for sexual content.
Yeah.
Usually, yeah. Violence is generally a very undercut thing, especially in American video games where
I think the only violent one that got up there for violence itself was one of the Soldier of Fortune games. I think.
Yeah, I actually know what you're talking
There
about.
was Manhunt, wasn't it?
Manhunt was rated M.
It was only M?
Oh, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was also temporarily put on AO, but that was for the whole hot coffee fiasco, not for the violent content in the game.
That's one thing also. Video game violence is super undercut as far as importance in American video game markets. Most people in America at least, and this extends to not only video games but movies too, but sexual content seems to be a bit more important. I remember that was a huge limiting factor in my household as well when it came to me being able to buy video games. So it really does seem to be an oddly backwards thing when it comes to what we're allowed to see and what we aren't.
Yeah, as opposed to places like in Europe where sexual content can be anywhere from like 12 to 15, while it's the violence that it's where it's banned. I think Germany is the worst at that, where a lot of games, if it's a shooter, at least back in the 90s, they would have to edit out the blood and just make it like green and make the enemies always zombies or something like that.
I heard like Australia. I know Australia has some hard limits.
Because Australia is trying really hard to be Europe. Because they wish they still were. Because otherwise they're just an island in the middle of nowhere full of things wanting them dead.
All Australians rage at you right now.
I don't know.
Bring it.
Think, honestly, I think there should be some limits on violence. Not necessarily on the realism, but on the types of violence that is depicted in games. Not
So like the actual acts and not like. Because
Yeah.
when we're saying like violence is more real, like what makes violence more realistic?
Well,
Like-
when I talk about realism, I mean like how one-to-one it is with real life. But the I think there are certain things in games that maybe if you don't limit them, you definitely have to be careful because these are controversial, like torture, sexual assault, things like that. These are violent acts, and if you don't very clearly make the distinction that this is a bad thing that should not be done, and it's not tastefully done, you're going to have a controversy.
Yes.
I mean, Grand Theft Auto 5 got away with it when they made you just fully torture that one guy for information.
Yeah, but then they
That's-
went back on the whole thing by being like, "Oh, torture's super terrible and everything," and it
Well-
had this Trevor going on this weird rants that wasn't really in character.
That's the other thing. If there's not a limit on the kinds of violence that can be depicted in a video game, I think there should be a limit on the kinds of violent acts that you can commit. Because it's one thing to watch a bad thing happen to another person, but in video game, like in a movie, you can watch the main protagonist just rip apart a bunch of people because he's the action hero who rips apart a bunch of people. But video games are an interactive medium, and you don't say, whenever you're describing gameplay in a video game, you don't, like in a Sonic game, you're not like, oh yeah, Sonic jumped over these hills and beat a bunch of robots. You say, I jumped over these hills and beat a bunch of robots, because you're controlling the character. You are projecting yourself onto the character. So things like being able to torture someone or being able to violate someone, I think it's kind of difficult to say that everyone should be able to do that, because it's different from watching someone else do it. It's you putting yourself in someone else's shoes and saying, okay, I am going to do this. And while lots of people can make the distinction that this is a bad thing that should not be done and this is only happening in the confines of this game, some people use this to live out their like fantasies and things like that. I think it doesn't help that you can desensitize yourself to this stuff by saying, oh, it's just a video game, I'd never do this in real life, but then you keep going back to it and reliving it, saying, oh yeah, this is fun in this video game, but I'd never do this in real life because that's a bad thing. But it's a lot of fun in this game.
I think I generally I understand what you're trying to say, but I think I generally disagree. I think people are kind of entitled to their own choices when it comes to video games, and they can choose what they can and can't play. Again, I think the rating system is there for like this exact reason, is to like certain types of violence are viewed worse than others. For example, hatred. I believe it was AO. I remember seeing it was AO. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry.
I mean, if it was AO, I don't think you'd be able to buy it
Let
on
us know in
Steam.
the comments section.
Well, it wasn't on Steam for a while, remember?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Never mind.
I remember it was rated AO, not necessarily because it was like that violent, but because of the context of the violence. So that is already there. Those limits are already placed, but it's only limiting to a certain group of people. The mass populace are still able to get it. And I don't think like the problems of like a certain group, a certain number of people should be able to limit the mass populace it sells. Honestly, it really does come down to personal choice. If you can't take that kind of violence, then you should really stay away. If you're messed up that you think this violence is like a beautiful thing, like that this is something to be glorified, then that's really that's a personal issue. Like, I don't think the mass of video games should be blamed if one person becomes violent because of video games. I think it's a problem with the person if the person becomes violent because of video games.
I mean, I don't think it's the means of violence that you use when you're hurting people in games. I think it's the target what it really comes down to. Look at games like Wolfenstein or Doom where you're tearing through, well, actually any game where you're fighting Nazis or demons from hell. I mean,
especially the new Doom.
Yeah, I mean, in the new Doom, you can chainsaw a demon in half, or punch a hole through their head, or stab them with their own teeth, and that's some of the most brutal violence I've ever seen in a video game.
As I said, it's context. Like, for example, GTA and Hatred aren't too different in how their main target can be civilians. But while GTA is like, oh, the civilians are just kind of here, you don't have to kill them or anything. No one tells you to. Hatred tells you explicitly to.
With your little first OC main character.
Yeah, it's a thing of context, and I think the ESRB, as stupid and silly as it can be, really is probably one of the best limiters we can have on video games, and to a lesser extent the European Rating Board.
Even if the origin of the ESRB is kind of hilarious.
Yep.
Well, with the whole night trap being considered one of the.
Oh man, I forgot about the whole night.
Yeah, it was that and Mortal Kombat that are responsible for the ESRB.
That game has a fantastic theme song.
Anyway.
Or that theme song is
honestly,
a
it's why
game attached to
Nazis
it.
are pretty much the default protagonists whenever you're creating a story in any medium.
Default antagonists.
Protagonists, Jacob?
I didn't mean to say that.
Wrong antagonist.
Listen, I'm German. That was an accident, I swear.
Please come back after some technical difficulties. We were having a slight cache change.
Anyway, yeah. Nazis are the default antagonists, because we can all agree, the Nazis were bad people.
Yeah.
They did horrible things. It's why whenever writing a story like, start with Nazis as the bad guys, go from there.
It's really easy.
That's why for like 10 years, every FPS villain was a Nazi, up until Call of Duty Modern Warfare came along and made it terrorists.
Yeah.
So, is the problem more aimed at the act of violence or what the violence is aimed to? Because from what I'm getting here, I'd say it's probably, if it's not human, then why are we worried?
I think it's all in the eye of the beholder, really. It really depends who you're talking to. Most people will say violence in video games is the reason that video games are like this trashy medium.
Oh, you got plenty of people spewing out that.
Yeah, and plenty of people think like violence in video games causes violence in real life. I think that if you have if that's in your mindset so much that a video game can trigger your own act of real life violence, and chances are any act of aggression stimuli would have done that to you.
Yeah, if it's making you go out and do terrible things, it's probably not the
It's
video
probably not
game's
the video game's
fault.
fault,
You
you.
probably actually need to seek
That's the
help.
thing, but we don't like to blame ourselves. We like to blame something else. It's easy to blame something that you usually can't fight back, such as
Children.
an art form.
Children.
You're on a roll today, aren't you, Jacob? First the Nazis as the protagonist, and now we're using children.
Anyway.
Anyone else got closing comments?
No, I don't think so.
Looks like that's all we have for today, folks. Thank you for tuning into another exciting round of Smack Talk. Let us know in the comments what you think about this. Try not to get too violent down there, otherwise I feel like it kind of defeats the point of today's show. Thanks again for tuning in. This is James.
I'm Jacob.
I'm Star.
I'm the funny Jacob.
Signing off.
Is it cool if I say Hitler did some things wrong?